Her father claimed no man would ever see her beauty until a lone rancher in Dodge Creek saw her fire. But will his gaze bring love, or light the fuse that tears the town apart? The prairie wind carried the scent of dust and sagebrush, curling through the warped boards of Dodge Creek's main street. It was the kind of wind that spoke in whispers, threading through the cracks in the saloon doors, slipping under the brim of your hat, to remind you that the land was older, harsher, and less forgiving than any man who ever tried to tame it. Folks in Dodge Creek knew trouble didn't come charging in like a wild stallion. No, it crept in slow, silent as dusk settling over the plains, until it was close enough to feel its breath on your neck. On the far edge of town, beyond the last hitching post and the rusted windmill that groaned when the breeze changed, stood a weathered farmhouse with paint worn thin by years of sun and sand. Inside lived Mary Beth Kane, a woman shaped as much by the prairie as by the man who raised her. Her father's words still clung to her like dust in her hair. "You're too plain for any man to notice." He'd spoken them once, years back, but the echo never faded. In a place where looks could decide a woman's fate as surely as her skill with a rifle or a skillet, those words weren't just cruel. They were a sentence. Mary Beth had learned to carry herself quiet, to slip through town like a shadow at sundown. She spoke little, not out of shyness, but because she knew the power of silence. In her eyes, the world was a place that tested you daily, where survival meant keeping your head low and your heart guarded. But beneath that quiet lay a stubborn ember, a fire she kept banked, hidden from those who might snuff it out. Then came Jack Rourke. He rode into Dodge Creek one late afternoon, when the sky was stretched in long streaks of gold and the heat still shimmered off the hard-packed dirt. He sat his saddle like a man who'd been born to it, dust clinging to his coat, the brim of his hat low enough to hide the story in his eyes. And yet, those eyes missed nothing. They lingered not on the town's painted ladies or its loud-mouthed gamblers, but on the quiet corners where people thought they were unseen. The first time he saw Mary Beth was outside the general store. She was balancing a crate of flour, her skirts tugged by the wind, a strand of hair breaking free to catch the sunlight. Most folks passed her by without a glance, but Jack's gaze stopped, not because she fit the mold of beauty Dodge Creek valued, but because she didn't. He saw the way she squared her shoulders under weight, not just of the crate, but of a life lived under someone else's judgment. It was only a heartbeat's worth of a glance, but in a small town, a heartbeat was long enough. Mrs. Kavanaugh, who'd been arranging ribbons in her shop window, saw it. The blacksmith's apprentice saw it. And by nightfall, the whisper had already found its way from the saloon to the church steps. In Dodge Creek, whispers were like prairie fire. You never knew who struck the match, but you knew they'd run faster than the flames they lit. Morning in Dodge Creek begins with the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, slow and steady, like it's setting the heartbeat for the whole town. Sunlight spills down Main Street, warming the creaking porch boards in front of the mercantile, catching on dust motes that drift in the still air. The smell of fresh biscuits from Miss Alder's bakery drifts through town, mingling with the faint tang of horse sweat and the sharper scent of iron from Sam Baker's forge. Sarah McCoy moves through it all quietly, her steps measured, her eyes lowered just enough to keep from catching the wrong gaze. She knows the rhythm of the town, who walks where, which boards squeak, which shadows hold a little more safety than the open street. Inside the mercantile, she stacks sacks of flour in the far corner, her hands quick and sure. The weight is familiar, almost comforting, something she can control in a world where most things aren't hers to decide. Out on the street, two ranch hands lean against the hitching post, spitting into the dirt and trading words they think are clever. "Shame about Earl's oldest," one says loud enough to carry. "Pretty as a fence post," the other laughs, the sound dry and mean. Sarah hears them, she always hears them, but she never turns. She's learned that looking back only feeds the wolves. Her father, Earl McCoy, is already halfway down the street, his voice sharp as dry mesquite snapping, bartering with cattle buyers. Earl's a man who believes work is worth more than words, unless the words are his. And when it comes to Sarah, his opinion's been carved in stone for years. No man worth his salt would marry her. The people in town follow his lead. The dress shop girls smile politely, but measure her with eyes that never quite soften. At church, she sits in the back pew, the scent of candle wax and pine benches filling the space where her mother's perfume once lingered. Sometimes she catches the preacher's wife looking her way, not unkindly, but with a kind of pity Sarah can't stand. Yet there are pieces of Dodge Creek that still belong to her alone. The narrow trail behind the church, where wild sunflowers lean toward the light. The quiet bend of the Red River, when the cattle drives are long gone, and the only sound is the slow push of water against the bank. The forge, where old Sam, Iron Hand Baker, lets her stand near enough to feel the heat without asking questions. The glow of the coals painting her hands in warm gold. It's in these corners she keeps herself whole, away from the noise, away from the stairs, away from the echo of her father's voice. Here, she can pretend for a moment she's just another young woman in Dodge Creek, not a story people pass around over beer and biscuits. But Dodge Creek has a way of pulling you into the open, no matter how far into the shadows you've learned to stand. The world beyond those quiet corners was already shifting, and the sound of it, faint, as the first stir of wind before a storm was coming down the trail toward her. The afternoon sun over Dodge Creek has a way of making everything look like it's been dipped in honey. Soft on the eye, but thick enough to slow your breathing. By 4 o'clock, the whole town seems to have gathered at the church hall, the whitewashed boards glowing against the wide blue sky. Sarah McCoy stands in the back corner, half hidden by a stack of chairs, her apron folded neatly and tucked away for the day. The air inside is warm, the kind of warmth that smells of lilacs, candle wax, and fresh-baked pies cooling on the side tables. Laughter rolls across the room in easy waves, bouncing from the fiddle player to the row of gossiping matrons, then settling around the dance floor where boots thump out the beat of an old reel. At the center of it all, Emily Carter, the bride, is a picture made for postcards. Her white dress catches every beam of sunlight like it's been waiting all its life for this one day. The men of Dodge Creek watch her with polite admiration, the women with a mix of fondness and quiet appraisal. Sarah's hands twist together in front of her skirt. She isn't part of the celebration, not really. She's here because Earl McCoy believes every event in Dodge Creek is a McCoy matter. "We show face," he'd said that morning, "not because they want us there, but because they need to know we're there." His words carried no hint that she might enjoy it. Earl McCoy moves through the crowd like a man who owns half of it, which in land and cattle he nearly does. His broad shoulders part conversations without effort, his hat tipping in acknowledgement only to those he deems worth it. He doesn't look toward Sarah. He doesn't need to. He knows she'll stay where he left her. When the music dips between songs, a cluster of men near the punch table chuckle over something said too softly for the bride to hear. Sarah catches one phrase clear as glass. "Poor Earl's girl, ain't got the face for a day like this." Her jaw tightens, but she doesn't move. She's heard worse. Still, the words land like grit in her teeth, sharp and impossible to swallow. The sound of hoofbeats outside shifts the room's rhythm. Folks glance toward the door just as it swings open, letting in a slice of sunlight and the tall figure of a man dusted from the trail. His coat is worn at the seams, his boots scuffed, but there's something about the way he stands. Straight-backed, calm, as if he belongs anywhere he decides to stop. Jack Callahan steps inside, sweeping the room with a slow gaze that takes in more than it shows. His eyes catch on Earl McCoy first. A nod of acknowledgement passes between men who know cattle and hard miles. Then his gaze moves on, landing for the briefest moment on Sarah McCoy in the shadow of the chairs. It isn't the quick, dismissive glance she's used to. This one lingers, not in a way that burns, but in a way that sees. She feels it in her chest before she understands it. The fiddle kicks up again, the caller shouting for pairs to form. Emily Carter is whisked onto the floor by her new husband, their boots moving in easy time. The laughter swells, hands clap in rhythm, and Sarah remains in her corner, a silent witness to a life that has never opened its door to her. But then Jack Callahan moves through the crowd. He doesn't weave like a man looking for someone. He walks straight, purposeful, until he's standing in front of her. "Miss McCoy," he says, tipping his hat. "Seems a shame for a lady to spend an afternoon watching other folks dance." Sarah blinks, caught between the instinct to refuse and the shock of being asked. Before she can answer, Earl McCoy's voice cuts from across the room. "She don't dance." Jack's eyes don't leave hers. "Maybe she just ain't had the right partner." A murmur runs through the crowd, the kind of murmur Dodge Creek will carry for weeks. Sarah feels every pair of eyes in the room, the weight of her father's stare heavy as a branding iron. But for the first time in a long while, she doesn't step back. She places her hand in Jack Callahan's, and he leads her onto the floor. The music swells. The boards creak under their boots. And somewhere in the hum of the crowd, something shifts. A note of surprise, a flicker of possibility. Tea the next morning came with a pale gray light, the kind that makes the prairie look endless and lonely all at once. A thin mist hung over Dodge Creek, curling low in the hollows, vanishing as the sun inched higher. The wind carried the faint scent of sage from the hills, and somewhere beyond the livery, a dog barked once and went quiet. Sarah had taken the narrow path along the back lots to avoid Main Street, her steps quick, shoulders slightly hunched against the morning chill. She knew these side tracks better than most. Which fence posts were loose, which gates stuck, where the grass grew tall enough to hide in if you needed to. She was almost to the Mercantile when she heard boots on gravel behind her. The sound wasn't hurried, just steady, like someone who had nowhere better to be and no reason to hide it. "Morning," Jack Callahan's voice came, steady as a man with no reason to rush. She slowed, not turning right away. "You're up early for someone who doesn't work in town." "Sun comes up, I get up," he said, falling in step beside her. "Besides, you can learn a lot about a place when it's quiet." "Like what?" she asked, glancing at him sidelong. "Like which folks carry their burdens on their backs, and which carry them in their eyes." Before she could answer, the Mercantile door banged open, and Earl McCoy stepped out, a ledger in one hand and his jaw already set. His eyes locked on Jack first, then slid to Sarah like a knife finding its sheath. "What's this?" Jack didn't flinch. "Just saying good morning." Earl's mouth tightened. Men who stand around John in the street ain't got much to show for themselves. Jack's reply was slow, deliberate, each word weighed. "Where I come from, a man's worth isn't measured by how loud he talks, Earl." It was the kind of line that could sit in the air for days if you let it, but Earl wasn't the type to let anything sit. He stepped closer, voice low but sharp. "This town doesn't need strangers stirring the pot. My daughter's got enough sense not to fall for trail dust and tall talk." Jack met his gaze evenly, his tone flat as sun-baked stone. "Dust washes off, and talk's only tall if a man can't stand behind it." The street had gone still. A few townsfolk lingered. Old Mrs. Dunley pretended to be adjusting the straps on her market basket. 2 ranch hands leaned against a wagon bed, whispering. The blacksmith's hammer paused mid-swing. In Dodge Creek, Moments like this traveled faster than the wind. Sarah felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She hated being the center of this slow-moving storm, yet some stubborn part of her wanted to see if Jack would hold his ground. Earl's eyes never left Jack. "I've seen your kind before. Ride in, stir up trouble, ride out before the dust settles." "Maybe," Jack said, his voice low. "Or maybe I stick around long enough to see the dust settle the right way." That did it. Earl turned to Sarah, his voice curt. "Inside. Now." She hesitated, not long, but long enough for her father to notice and for Jack to catch it. That flicker in Jack's eyes wasn't victory nor defiance. It was recognition, like he'd seen this same dance in other towns, with other walls built just as high. Inside the mercantile, the air was cooler, but thick with the scent of burlap, coffee beans, and something else. The quiet pulse of what had just happened outside. She moved behind the counter, hands busy, thoughts tangled. Through the open door, she caught one last glimpse of Jack as he turned toward the hitching rail, his gait slow, unhurried, like a man who knew the next move wasn't his to make. Yet. And if you'd been there, watching the way the street's heartbeat had skipped when those two men locked eyes, you might ask yourself what I'm about to ask you now. When a man pushes back against a wall that's been there your whole life, do you turn away, or do you see if he might just move it? By the time the sun had climbed over the grain mill roof, Dodge Creek was already in a stir. It didn't take much in a small town, a sharp word in the street, a look that lasted a second too long, and suddenly every corner was humming with half-heard stories. That morning, the hum had Sarah McCoy's name in it. The mercantile bell had barely finished chiming when Mrs. Dunley slipped inside, her market basket on one arm and a smile on her face that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mornin', Sarah," she said, lingering by the flour bins. "I saw you talking with that new fella yesterday. Jack Callahan, isn't it?" Sarah kept her tone neutral. "Just exchanged greetings." Mrs. Dunley murmured, like she was agreeing with something she hadn't yet said. She left with her purchases, but by the time she hit the boardwalk, two more women had joined her, heads bent close. It was always like this. Stories didn't walk in Dodge Creek, they galloped. By mid-morning, the blacksmith had heard some version of the encounter, though in his telling, Jack had challenged Earl McCoy to a shooting match. Over at the saloon, someone claimed Jack had promised to set things right in the McCoy family, whatever that meant. Sarah tried to keep her head down, stocking shelves and measuring out coffee beans, but each time the bell above the door rang, she felt the shift in the air. Folks didn't just come for supplies that day, they came for a closer look. She caught sight of them through the front windows, two ranch hands leaning on the hitching rail, eyes on the mercantile like they were waiting for the next act of a play. A couple of cowboys from the Double T spread stopped on their way to the saloon, their conversation pausing as they glanced at the door. Then Jack himself appeared, his hat tipped low, a slow stride carrying him across the street. He didn't hurry, didn't avoid the stares. If anything, he seemed to absorb them, letting the silence stretch. The bell jingled as he stepped inside. "Morning, Miss McCoy." Her pulse jumped despite herself. "Mr. Callahan." "Just Jack's fine." He set a small list on the counter, coffee, nails, a coil of rope, the kind of order that said he was planning to stay a while. From the corner, Mr. Greeley, the undertaker, pretended to study a display of lamp oil, but was clearly listening. Outside, boots scuffed against the porch planks as someone shifted closer to the door. The mercantile felt smaller, the air thicker. Earl McCoy emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes flicked to Jack, then to Sarah, and he didn't waste a second. "You again." Jack's tone was even. "I needed supplies." "You could have gone to Benson's in the next town." "Could have," Jack said, "but Benson's doesn't have what I'm looking for." His gaze didn't leave Sarah's. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was tight, full of the weight of what everyone wasn't saying. Somewhere behind Sarah, a bag of grain settled on its shelf with a soft rustle, and outside, a horse snorted. Earl stepped closer, his shadow falling across the counter. "You got business here, Callahan?" Jack didn't blink. "Maybe I do." That was all it took. A few customers slipped out the door, no doubt heading straight to the saloon to feed the rumor mill. Sarah felt the ground shift under her, not in a dangerous way yet, but in the way a riverbank starts to give before a flood. By afternoon, the whispers had turned into open speculation. Down at the saloon, Hank Porter was laying odds on whether Jack would last the week before Earl ran him out. At the church quilting circle, Mrs. Alder told anyone who'd listen that Jack had a look about him, and no one quite knew if she meant that in warning or in favor. Even the kids caught the drift. A pair of barefoot boys raced past the mercantile shouting, "Careful, Sarah, here comes your cowboy," before disappearing down the alley in a burst of laughter. Sarah tried to pretend it didn't touch her, but it did. Every look, every murmur, pressed against the walls she'd built to keep herself steady. And somewhere beneath all that, a stubborn ember burned, not of romance, not yet, but of something rarer in Dodge Creek, the feeling of being seen. That night, as the sky burned itself out in shades of orange and violet, Sarah stood on the back porch of the mercantile, watching dust settle over the far pasture. The air smelled of wood smoke and the faint sweetness of drying hay. She thought about Jack's gaze, steady, unhurried, like a man who wasn't just passing through her life, but marking the map. She didn't know yet if that was a promise or a threat. Out in the street, the saloon doors banged open and two men staggered out, their laughter carrying. One of them spotted her, tipped his hat and called, "Careful, Miss McCoy, Dodge Creek's watchin'." She closed the door against the night, but their words stayed. And she couldn't help wondering. Maybe Dodge Creek was watching, but what they'd see next, that might not be Earl's choice to make. Now, if you'd been sitting here by this fire with me, hearing how a single conversation can tilt a whole town off its balance, I'd ask you this. When the eyes of an entire street are on you, do you shrink into the shadows, or step into the center and let them see who you really are? Saturday in Dodge Creek had a way of drawing folks out whether they needed something or not. The sun was high but not yet brutal, the kind of light that painted every board and brick with sharp edges. Wagons rolled slow along Main Street, horses flicked their tails against the flies, and the porch rails were lined with men who'd been just passing by for the better part of an hour. There'd been talk all week, the kind that travels faster than the stagecoach, about the McCoy girl, the new cowboy, and her father's temper. Every telling had added its own polish until the truth was just one more version in the pile. But everyone agreed on this much. Something was bound to happen, and they weren't about to miss it. Sarah McCoy stood just inside the mercantile doorway, her hand on the frame, watching the street like a hawk watches the horizon. Across the way, the saloon doors swung wide, and Jack Callahan stepped into the light. He moved with that steady, unhurried stride of his, like a man who didn't see the point of rushing to meet trouble, but wouldn't turn from it either. It might have passed as nothing more than another morning. If Earl McCoy hadn't appeared at the far end of the street, stepping out from behind the feed store with the look of a man already halfway through a fight. He cut across the dust, boots falling heavy, eyes locked on Jack. The murmurs started before they were even close. The blacksmith set down his hammer. The barber's hands went still on his customer's head. Even Mrs. Alder, who was hanging laundry behind the boarding house, stopped with a clothespin in midair. "Callahan," Earl called, his voice carrying over the hum of flies and the creak of saddle leather. Jack tipped his hat slightly. "Morning, Earl." "Morning won't change what's been going on," Earl said, closing the distance. "You've been walking too close to things that aren't yours." Jack stayed where he was. "If you mean your daughter, we've talked in daylight, in front of God and everybody. That's hardly stealing." A ripple of low laughter from somewhere down the boardwalk quickly shushed. Earl's jaw tightened. Dodge Creek doesn't take kindly to drifters planting roots in places they don't belong. Jack's voice was calm, but the kind of calm that made men stand up straighter. Roots grow where they can. Sometimes they take hold in hard ground. The air between them was hot enough to shimmer. Sarah could feel her breath catch. She knew her father's pride was a coiled spring, and Jack's way of talking was the kind that could pull it tight. But before Earl could let loose, another sound cut through. The steady, deliberate rhythm of hooves on packed dirt. Heads turned toward the south end of town. A lone rider approached, tall in the saddle, a bay horse throwing dust with each step. The man wore a long trail coat despite the heat, and pinned to his chest was the gleam of a deputy's badge. The crowd shifted, whispers darting like minnows in a shallow stream. "Clayton Reese," someone muttered, and the name moved through the street faster than the horse. Sarah felt the name settle in her gut like a stone. Reese wasn't just a lawman. He had a reputation that stretched farther than Dodge Creek. Trouble didn't follow him. He brought it along. He reined in between Jack and Earl, letting his horse's shadow fall over both men. "Heard there was a bit of tension brewing," Reese said, voice smooth as oiled leather. "Thought I'd see it for myself." "This doesn't concern you, Reese," Earl said. "That's so." Reese swung down from his horse, boots hitting the dirt with a slow, deliberate thud. "Because from where I'm standing, it smells a whole lot like the mess Callahan left behind in Coldwater." Jack's eyes didn't waver. "Coldwater's in the past." "Past has a funny way of catching up," Reese replied, "especially when there's blood on the trail." A murmur rose from the crowd. Blood on the trail wasn't something you said lightly. Earl turned his head slightly toward Reese. "What are you talking about?" Reese's gaze stayed locked on Jack. "Dry Creek Crossing. Stagecoach job gone bad. 3 men never made it home. And last I heard, Jack Callahan was right there in the middle of it." Sarah felt the porch boards cold under her bare feet. She'd heard of Dry Creek. Everyone had. But hearing Jack's name tangled up in it was like finding a snake coiled under your own bed. "That's a lie," Jack said, but there was a weight in his voice now, a tension he hadn't shown before. "Then you won't mind if I tell the folks here the rest," Reese said, stepping closer. "About how you rode out that night before the law came looking. About the way you left a man to take the fall in your place." The crowd tightened. Sarah saw Mr. Greeley the undertaker edge forward, his eyes sharp. The blacksmith crossed his arms. The wind carried the faint scent of horses and sweat, mingling with something sharper, the metallic taste of accusation. Earl looked between them, his expression shifting from suspicion to something colder. "If even half of that's true, Callahan, you've got no business breathing the same air as my daughter." Jack didn't answer right away. His hand rested easy on his belt, but his eyes had gone hard, distant, like he was back somewhere else entirely. Finally he said, "You think you know the story, Earl?" "You don't, and neither does Reese." "Funny," Reese said. "I've got the badge, which means my story's the one that sticks." That was when Sarah spoke, not loud, but clear enough to cut through the street noise. Maybe Dodge Creek ought to hear both stories before it makes up its mind. Every head turned toward her. She could feel her father's stare, the weight of it, but she didn't look away. Reese's smile was slow, calculated. "Careful, Miss McCoy. You keep standing next to him, and folks might start thinking you're part of his story too." "I'll take that risk," she said. For a long moment, no one moved. The heat shimmered off the dust. The flies buzzed in lazy circles, and somewhere far off, a dog barked. Finally, Reese turned back to Jack. "You've got until sundown to ride out. If you're still here when the lamps are lit, I'm coming back, and I won't be alone." He swung into the saddle, tugged the reins, and rode slow down the length of Main Street, letting every man, woman, and child see the shape of the warning he'd left behind. When the dust settled, Jack was still standing there, the crowd still watching. And if you'd been there by the fire tonight, listening to this tale, I'd tell you that was the moment Dodge Creek stopped seeing him as a stranger. From then on, Jack Callahan was a man with a shadow long enough to touch every porch in town, and a choice ahead that could burn the whole place down or set it free. Afternoons in Dodge Creek had a way of slowing to a crawl, but not today. By the time the sun had shifted just past its peak, word of Reese's warning had rolled through every kitchen, every stable, every porch like a dust storm you could taste in your teeth. Folks who hadn't been there in the morning came drifting into town, leaning against hitching posts, pretending to be shopping or just out for a walk. Truth was, they were waiting for Jack to leave, for Reese to return, or for something they didn't quite dare name. Inside the Silver Spur Saloon, the air was cooler but heavy, smelling of whiskey and pine resin from the sawdust on the floor. Jack sat at the far end of the bar, one boot hooked over the rung, hat brim low. The bartender, Slim Parsons, was drying the same glass for the third time, trying to work up the nerve to speak. "You figure on staying?" Slim finally asked, not looking up from the glass. Jack's voice came low and easy. "If a man runs every time trouble tips its hat, he'll never make it past the county line." Sarah stepped in just then, eyes scanning the room until they found him. She moved to his side like she'd been walking that path her whole life. "You could ride out now, before sundown," she said, softer than a whisper but sharp enough to cut. Jack looked at her, then past her, to where the open doorway framed the dusty street. "And leave you to face the gossip alone? That'd be the kind of thing a man don't live down." Before she could answer, the batwing doors slapped open and in walked Jed Holloway, a ranch hand with more beer than blood in his veins most days, but a sharp mind under it. He tipped his hat to Sarah, then nodded to Jack. "You got more friends here than you think, Callahan," Jed said, "and more folks tired of Reese's kind of law." Jack gave a dry half smile. "Careful, Jed. Talking like that might get you in the story, too." Jed shrugged. "Ain't much of a life if you ain't in a few dangerous stories." That's when the first real crack in the day appeared. A boy, no more than 12, burst through the doors, wide-eyed and panting. "They're coming," he gasped. "Reese, and he ain't alone." The room went still. The clink of glasses stopped, chairs froze mid-sway, even the ceiling fan seemed to slow. Jack pushed back from the bar, the scrape of his chair legs loud in the hush. Out on the street, you could see them now. Reese riding point, a thin smile on his face, and behind him, 4 men you didn't mistake for ranchers. They wore their guns like a second skin, eyes scanning, hands loose but ready. As the posse drew closer, Jack stepped off the boardwalk and into the street, dust curling around his boots. Sarah stood in the doorway of the saloon, hands clenched at her sides. Jed moved to stand just behind her shoulder. Reese reined in about 10 feet away. "Clock struck, Callahan," he said, voice smooth as snake oil. "Time to choose your trail." Jack let the silence stretch until it felt like the whole town was leaning forward. "Sometimes," he said finally, "a man doesn't choose the trail. Sometimes the trail chooses him." Reese's smile twitched. "Then let's see if yours runs uphill." The wind shifted, carrying the creak of saddle leather, the faint rattle of spurs. The crowd pressed in from both ends of the street, holding its breath. Somewhere, a door slammed, and the sound cracked through the tension like a starter's pistol. The next moments would decide everything: who stood with Jack, who turned away, and whether Dodge Creek would remember this as the day it bowed its head, or the day it bared its teeth. The sun had dipped just enough to throw long, hard shadows down Main Street, turning the space between Jack Callahan and Clayton Reese into a strip of shifting gold and deep black. Heat rippled off the dust, rising in soft waves, distorting the edges of everything: the buildings, the people, even the truth. Jack stood in the center of it, boots planted square, hat brim casting his eyes into shade. Behind him, he could feel Dodge Creek watching, not just with eyes, but with years of quiet frustration, whispered judgments, and the kind of hopes people didn't speak aloud because they were too fragile to risk the air. In his gut, the day was twisting into something more than a standoff. It wasn't about Sarah alone anymore. It wasn't even about Reese's grudge or Coldwater's shadow. It was about what kind of man he would let himself be, here, in a place that had already tried to decide for him. Reese sat straight in the saddle, badge catching the light. His posse fanned out a little, just enough to make a point. He had the town framed like a hunter frames a deer. "I gave you your chance to leave quiet," Reese said, his voice carrying that low menace of a man who knows the crowd is already half on his side. Jack's mouth felt dry as the trail in August, but his voice came even. "You ever notice, Reese, how the man who talks about peace is usually the one pointing the gun?" A flicker crossed Reese's face, not quite anger, more like recognition. He'd played this game before. He'd won it before. But Dodge Creek was different. Behind Reese, one of his men shifted in the saddle, resting a hand near his holster. The movement was subtle, but the crowd caught it. A ripple of unease spread along the boardwalk. Sarah felt her nails dig into her palms. She'd never seen Jack draw, but she'd heard the stories, quick enough to make a man regret blinking. Jack didn't look at the guns. He looked at Reese. "Dry Creek Crossing," he said quietly, but loud enough to cut the air. "You think you know what happened? You weren't there." Reese's smile returned, slow and sharp. "Then enlighten us." And for a moment, Jack wanted to tell it. The ambush that wasn't his, the friend he couldn't save, the way the law in Coldwater had been bought before the first shot was fired. He wanted to drag the truth into the light and let the town see the dirt on Reese's badge. But he knew what would happen. Reese would talk louder, twist harder, until the truth was another casualty. So instead, Jack took a step forward, boots crunching the grit. "You got a choice, Reese. You can ride out and let Dodge Creek decide for itself what kind of law it wants. Or you can find out if yours bleeds like any other man's." That was when something shifted, not in Reese, but in the crowd. Jed Holloway stepped down off the boardwalk, his boots hitting the street like punctuation. "Ain't no law worth a damn if it's just one man's grudge dressed up with a badge," he said, voice flat but carrying. Another figure moved, Slim Parsons from the saloon, then old Mrs. Alder of all people, stepping right up to the edge of the street. "We've had enough of folks telling us who we can talk to, who we can trust," she said, her voice shaking but strong. Reese's eyes darted to them, then back to Jack. His smile had thinned into a line. "You're making them choose sides, Callahan?" "No," Jack said. "You did that when you rode in here with your story and your gun." For a moment, it felt like the whole town was holding a single breath. The heat pressed down, the flies hovered in lazy spirals, and the space between the two men felt like it could snap into violence at any second. Then Reese swung his leg over, stepping down from the saddle. Dust puffed up around his boots. He walked forward, slow and deliberate, until he was close enough for Jack to see the fine cracks in the silver of his badge. "You're not worth the lead," Reese said, voice pitched low. "But you stay, and you'll find out just how far I'll go to make sure you regret it." He turned, mounted up, and jerked his head for his men to follow. They wheeled their horses in a cloud of dust, riding back down the street without looking back. Jack stood there until the sound of hooves faded. Only then did the town exhale. People began to move again, the way a herd does after a predator passes, slow, cautious, glancing back as if to be sure it was really gone. Sarah stepped down into the street, stopping in front of him. Her eyes searched his face. "You could have drawn." Jack shook his head. "Some fights, Sarah. They're won by standing still." But as he turned to walk with her toward the mercantile, he knew Reese wasn't gone. The man had planted something in Dodge Creek. Suspicion, fear, maybe even doubt. And that kind of seed had a way of sprouting when you least expected it. And in that quiet moment, with the sun slipping lower and the dust settling, Jack understood something he hadn't wanted to face. The real fight hadn't started yet. Evening draped Dodge Creek in a stillness that felt almost fragile. The last orange light sank behind the ridge, and the street lamps, a patchwork of oil lanterns and candles in dusty windows, took over the work of keeping the night at bay. The air had cooled enough for the scent of sagebrush to drift in from the flats. Jack sat on the back steps of the livery, elbows resting on his knees, turning that old Mexican silver coin over in his fingers. Its edges were worn smooth from years of use, and he'd carried it from cattle drives in Montana to river crossings in Arizona. It wasn't worth much to anyone else, but to him it was a reminder that some things don't have to be shiny to be valuable. He heard the boards of the walkway creak, and Jed Holloway appeared, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Town's quiet," Jed said, settling onto the step beside him. "Too quiet. Feels like the whole place is holding its breath." Jack gave a slow nod. "That's the West for you. Calm never stays long, but sometimes a quiet night is the best time to remember a few truths." He turned the coin once more in his palm, then spoke, his voice low and even, as if he were talking to the dark itself. "First truth. You can't fight every battle with a gun. In this country, folks think courage comes from drawing first, but I've seen enough graves to know sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not take the shot." Today, Reese wanted a show, a quick draw, something the crowd would talk about for years. If I'd given him that, maybe one of us would be dead, maybe both. And Dodge Creek would remember the blood, not the reason it was spilled. Out here, you pick your moments, or the moments pick you, and they won't always be kind. Second truth. Your worth isn't in the stories told about you. It's in the choices you make when no one's looking. Rumors are as common as dust out here. They blow in, settle for a while, then get kicked up again by the next strong wind. Sarah's been living under those whispers all her life, same as me since Dry Creek Crossing. She could have stepped aside today, let me face Reese alone, kept herself safe. But she didn't. She walked right into the middle of it. Nobody asked her to. Nobody gave her a medal. But it's those choices, the ones folks don't see, that make a person's backbone. Third truth, what you plant in the world is what grows. Reese planted fear today, plain and simple. He made a show of power, hoping it'd stick in people's minds. That's how men like him keep control, not with the badge, but with the seed of doubt. Me? I aim to plant something else. Trust, respect, a sense that maybe we don't have to live under someone's thumb. It won't take root right away. No good thing does. But give it time, give it care, and it'll grow stronger than the weeds. Jed was quiet for a while, staring out at the dark street. "Sounds like you're planning to stick around," he said finally. Jack let the coin rest in his palm, its cool weight grounding him. "Plans are like rivers," he said. "They change course when the land tells them to. But right now, yeah, I'm here." The two men sat without speaking after that, the only sound the soft hum of crickets and the occasional creak of an old building settling. Somewhere in town, a door closed with a solid thud. Stars pricked the sky, sharp as a trail of silver spurs. And for a few hours, Dodge Creek breathed easier. Though deep down, Jack knew this was only the eye of the storm. Even in today's fast-moving, wired-up world, there's something timeless in the way a cowboy faces life. The grit to stand your ground when the odds are long. The patience to weather the seasons, knowing that not every storm lasts forever. The respect for the land beneath your boots, because you understand it's the same earth that feeds you and tests you. The way a handshake still means something, even when paper contracts and digital signatures have taken over. The quiet dignity of a man or woman who does the right thing, not because it's easy, but because it's right. The modern city dweller could learn the cowboy's rhythm. to work hard when the sun's up and rest easy when it sets. To keep their word, because without it, you've got nothing. To treat neighbors like partners on the same trail, not rivals in a race. To carry themselves with enough humility to tip a hat to a stranger, and enough pride to stand tall in the face of disrespect. And maybe most of all, to hold fast to hope, the kind that keeps a rider moving forward, even when the trail ahead is nothing but dust and uncertainty. Howdy friends, welcome to our little campfire here on YouTube. This channel is where we keep the spirit of the Wild West alive. Every week we share true-hearted cowboy trail stories full of grit, honor, and human spirit. Some tales will stir your courage, some will touch your heart, and some may even test your sense of right and wrong. The West wasn't just about gunfights. It was about choices, sacrifice, and the bonds we forge. We've got plenty more stories coming, each with its own dust, wind, and soul. Your thoughts and expectations matter. Tell us what you'd love to hear next. Maybe it's a rancher's redemption, a drifter's last stand, or a woman's quiet strength in a hard land. Drop your ideas in the comments. We read every word. Until next time, ride steady, stay safe, and may peace find you wherever your trail leads.